Our fifth module focuses on chapter 6, which is on masculinity. I did skip chapter 5, which is the chapter that focuses on intersectionality and how other identities that we hold outside of gender, how those might influence particular gender strategies that are available to us. We are going to be coming back to that chapter. But just kind of in keeping with our focus on the binary, I wanted to go ahead and get into chapters 6 and later 7 on femininity. And so this chapter kind of begins by emphasizing the fact that, we've already said that the binary is socially constructed, that there is nothing inherent or natural or inevitable about this system. And the system, and this is a large point of what this chapter is trying to address, this system is oppressive to both men and women. But oftentimes you hear women complain about this system as being limiting or unfair much more readily than you maybe hear the average man complain. And that's actually kind of the primary question for this chapter. If both men and women are constrained by a binary gender system, why is it that more women than men find this system unfair? So we'll be coming back to this question at the end of this chapter, because once you have a little bit more background about the contents of the masculinity gender expression, kind of historically, some important things about the masculine gender expression, other forms of masculinity besides the dominant form, which is hegemonic masculinity. This question will be easier for you to address, easier to answer. So this chapter begins off, interestingly enough, with a historical overview of cheerleading. And this is from an image off the internet, No Boys, No Problem. And you might say, okay, well, yeah, there are plenty of all-female cheerleading squads out there. And in cheerleading, if you think back to our early chapter where we talk about looking at things through those, that binary gender glasses where things are either masculine or feminine, cheerleading is one of those activities that is placed in the femininity column. So you maybe were surprised to learn that historically, the gender associated with cheerleading was actually men and not women. They say that, from the kind of beginning of cheerleading, which was in the mid 1800s, cheerleading originally was an all-male sport. And it was characterized by gymnastics and stunts and crowd leadership. And it was specifically that concept of, being kind of leaders, that made it be associated with men. And they talked about all of the kind of famous men, semi-famous men who have been cheerleaders. Several presidents, actors have been cheerleaders. And so, it was spoken of as being a high honor, a great responsibility, and women weren't even given the opportunity to be cheerleaders until, unsurprisingly, during the era of the World Wars. So with the First World War, as men were off fighting, this is kind of when women were first given spots on the field. And originally there was some concern because the sport was deemed too masculine, and people were afraid that it would make the women who participated in it too masculine. And they talked about how some schools even banned female cheerleaders and refused to include them or recognize squads that included them. And so what's really interesting, and this is the quote that I kind of pulled out there from page 128, is that instead of changing how we thought about women, the presence of women in cheer changed how people thought about cheering. So as women continued to stick it out and remain cheerleaders, and then they said this particularly became the trend, by the time we reached World War II and the years following World War II, by that time, women cheerleaders were here to stay. But those qualities that people had associated with cheerleaders when they were men, great honor, leadership, it's not that women at the time then were able to kind of enjoy those stereotypes of cheerleading. Instead, what happened, the perception of cheerleading itself changed. And instead of it being seen as this high honor, it kind of became associated, as your book said, with blondness and being cute, and being energetic and peppy. And its prestige declined by the 1970s. So within a couple of decades of having increasing numbers of female cheerleaders, it became gendered in the opposite way. And so this is interesting because, we'll later talk about in this chapter, we see this male flight, we see this shift happen when something becomes feminized. That it does become devalued and degraded, and that men often exit from it, in this mass exodus, not just with cheerleading, but, with occupations, with college majors, some even argue with higher education itself. And so in order to understand this, your book emphasizes what we really have to understand is, that gender and gender expression isn't just about individual choice and how you choose to wear your hair and what you choose to do. It really is about power. And so that is kind of that's why they start off with this kind of frivolous example, because although it is a frivolous example, it makes an important point about power and power relations that exist between men and women in society. So then we kind of get into this discussion about how our society is organized in the past as well as now. And it gives you like three important terms, like right off the bat. The first one you probably have heard plenty of times before, and that's patriarchy. And that basically just means rule of the father. And what it means in the social sense is that whether you're talking about women of all ages or younger men, adult men are the head of the family, they're head of the household, and societies, these early patriarchal societies, women had no rights to their own bodies. They had no rights to their own children. They couldn't own property. They couldn't, hold many public occupations. If they did work outside the home, they required permission from husbands or from fathers, and their earnings often went directly to those husbands or fathers. In a patriarchy, it is the patriarch's word, authority that matters. They are the only ones in society that matters. And in these early societies, particularly ones that were monarchies and had landed gentry, it's like, okay, well, yeah, if you're a peasant, you're a serf, you might be patriarch in your own home, but under the feudal system, your lord, your duke, the landed gentry, they are the patriarch, right, of your area. And then they report to a king, a monarch, who is the ultimate patriarch. And this is how, of course, a lot of societies were set up for a long period of time. But eventually, they did shift into what your book described as being more of what's called a democratic brotherhood. And, so think about, of course, America, 1776, setting up our initial democracy, and in a democratic brotherhood, once again, all the rights are held by men, and they're limited to certain classes of men. But as your book correctly notes, over time, those classes of men expanded, to include more men than those who originally enjoyed those privileges. In the Democratic Brotherhood, what did not happen was women of any group or class in being able to enjoy those same privileges. Now, at some point, of course, if we're focusing particularly on the United States, we move from that Democratic Brotherhood to what we now have, which is what your book labels formal gender equality. And what that basically is saying is that, at least by law, men and women are supposed to be equal citizens, right? So there are laws that are set up to protect people from discrimination on the basis of sex. in occupations, in education, in the public sector. Women can now, of course, get credit cards in their own name and open bank accounts. They can rent apartments as well as take out mortgage loans and buy homes, none of which was possible during patriarchal or societies based on democratic brotherhood. But, this formal gender equality, your book then kind of pokes some holes into that, because even with this formal gender equality, where we say men and women are equal, they're equal citizens under, the eye of the law, your book makes some observations. One observation being is that in a lot of ways, despite men and women being equal, men are still seen as being the generic human. That when we we might say, like, you guys, and we just accept that, that's a default term, and it includes women, in a way that you gals is not the type of term that we ever use. We talk about certain professions, and what we imagine, of course, is that these professions are men, unless, of course, we add a gender identifier, which is why some people will say things like, oh, a female doctor. And that's crazy, because you hear people say a female doctor or a female police officer or a female firefighter. And you hardly ever people say male doctor, male police officer, male firefighter. And that's because it's the idea that those occupations are normative for men, in a way that they're not for women. And so your book talks about, of course, how men's identity as men is often invisible even to themselves, while women's identity as women is usually centrally important, if not to women, at least to other people who are interacting with them, who are perceiving them. And this should remind you of the concept that was introduced in chapter 1, the privilege of invisibility, right? And it's that idea that, when you are considered to be the generic human, then your gender isn't very important, in the same way that it is when you're not considered to be the generic human. And so, we don't just see this in language, we also see this in, the media. And this is where your textbook mentions the Bechdel test. And so with that test, what has to happen is, is there a scene in a movie or TV show in which two named female characters talk to one another about something other than a man? And, there's always a lot of, there is always kind of a lot of controversy about all of the modern movies and films and shows that don't pass this test. And I give you an article if you want to read more about, the test, its limitations. Funny enough story. I mean, it was started through a mention in a comic strip. So, I think sometimes people think like an academic or a theorist came up with this, but it was really a cartoonist. And I give you a snapshot of that cartoon where she introduced this idea. And, they say that the reason why a lot of media, doesn't pass the Bechdel test is because the assumption is that women can still enjoy media that don't pass this test. And the concern is men wouldn't enjoy media that that do pass the test. And the way your book words this, and I'm sorry for my cough there, the way your book words this is women can identify with men because men are people, but men can identify with women because women are women. And what they're really emphasizing there is just this kind of divide between, what we sometimes call his and her media. And so, the his and her media concept, and so that's another way you could maybe remember that, is that his media is for his and her, but her media is often thought of as being just for her. So, we're at this point in society where we don't usually shame women who enjoy sports, which is considered his media, or enjoy video games, which is considered his media, or, enjoy action movies, superhero movies, which that whole like superhero, like geek culture is often associated with men. But, not a lot of men are active fans of the media that we consider to be her media, things like rom-coms or, soap operas. And the men who are fans, of course, and we'll talk about this more in a little bit, of course, they are slighted and disparaged, and their association with something feminine often makes them a target for gender policing. And once again, it's because of that kind of idea that what is for women, but what is for men could be potentially enjoyed by men and women. The other observation they make about society, even though we supposedly have this formal gender equality, is the extent to which that, we still associate power with masculinity. And once again, they talk about how there are examples of this in language as well as media. So with language, a lot of words that we associate with masculinity are also words that are synonymous with power, powerful, strong, dominant, domineering, aggressive, things like testosterone charge. We tell men, of course, to man up. All of that is this association with masculinity, and therefore, because by the binary, that means that there is this association with things that are non-powerful, things that are weak and gentle, empathetic. That these are things that are associated with women. And similar to what was said before about men being generic humans, and that being illustrated through the media, this association with power and aggressiveness with masculinity versus femininity is once again supported in the media. And this is where they talk about, and maybe those of you who are really into superheroes found this example interesting, but this is where they talk about how a lot of the superheroes, not only do male superheroes outnumber female superheroes, but that a lot of the female superheroes, their strengths and their powers are more likely to be mental as opposed to physical, as opposed to male superheroes who their powers are much more related to strength and invulnerability, and dominance. And so, all of this just suggests that if we are living in this society that has this perfect gender equality, wouldn't we have gotten to the point where men or women could be generic humans? And would we really be still associating, power and being powerful and all of those synonyms with just one gender, with one form of gender expression? And so this is part of what leads the authors to conclude that, what we really have with this formal gender equality is what they call a modified patriarchy. And modified patriarchies are societies in which women have been granted formal gender equality. So they do have these supposed equal protections under the law, but because of the patriarchal conflation of power with men and masculinity, they still in a lot of ways have this subordinate position in their lives, and in terms of how they're perceived by others. And so, when I say a subordinate position, this is what your book refers to as, relations of inequality, right? Like, how exactly are women and femininity positioned to be less powerful than men and masculinity? And your book provides like 3 primary relations of inequality that kind of shape this hierarchy, where you have men on top as being more powerful, and women, on the bottom and being less powerful. And so those 3 relations of inequality are sexism, androcentrism, and subordination. So let's begin with maybe the more clear-cut one, which is sexism. And this is just the favoring of male-bodied individuals over female-bodied individuals. And this can be both ideologically as well as in practice, meaning, it can be, it can be a mental preference that you do or do not act on, but it also can be, of course, your actions. And so, the reason why, or one primary reason why this sexism exists, is because it's oftentimes predicated on the belief that women are naturally weaker, men are naturally stronger, they're better suited for these more powerful, more dominant jobs and positions. And it's really hard, of course, to dismantle people's beliefs, and this can come forth as implicit bias, which we talked about in an earlier chapter. And so what does this mean? What does this look like? Well, formal gender equality means that people, when they put out job ads, can't say, and this position is only for men. And what their positions might even say is, we encourage a diverse application pool. So we encourage women and people of color to apply. And so everyone has the opportunity to apply, and everyone maybe even, or at least maybe the top candidates will be interviewed. But then this is where, especially since usually it's at that part where you kind of introduce the human element, this is where those implicit biases can really come into play. And so, your book talks specifically about a kind of systematic review of studies that kind of looked at sexist behavior across multiple contexts, when people were evaluating writing, artwork, job applications, biographies. And what they pretty much showed is that, holding everything else constant, women were evaluated less positively than men. The same resume, the same piece of art, the same written biography, with people thought it was written or created or belonged to a woman, they were more likely to evaluate it as being of lesser quality than when they thought it was written by, or written, created, whatever, by a man. Specifically, and sometimes, of course, and they note that this was true whether the person doing the rating was a man or a woman. And so this just kind of shows you, it's not that just these biases exist in men, but these biases also exist in women. And that makes sense because, of course, it comes from the kind of cultural messages that we pick up. Even people who you think should know better, people like scientists and academics, they also can fall into the same trap. So I give you a link to a really interesting study that had scientists rate job applicants, and they were fake applications, and all they were changing was the name and the sex associated with the applicant. And what they found was, pretty much across the board, they rated the male applicants higher than female applicants, even with those identical applications. And once again, this was true whether it was male or female scientists doing the rating. And so that's sexism. So that's one way in which, even with formal gender equality, why patriarchy still exists in that modified form. The second relation of inequality is androcentrism. And so if sexism is sex-based, androcentrism is gender-based, because in androcentrism, it is masculinity that is seen as being preferable than femininity. And so masculine expression is preferred and favored over feminine expression. And this isn't just true in terms of the cisgender men who are perhaps doing masculinity versus the cisgender women who are doing femininity. But what we really see are interesting examples of, like, how women who do masculinity are oftentimes going to be more valued in some settings and contexts than men who do femininity. So, and the examples that your book gives is that, girls, have kind of pushed their way into, sports that used to largely be dominated by men. But you don't see men necessarily as eagerly entering sports that are associated with femininity. So, think about things like your book mentions synchronized swimming, softball. You might want to add to that like figure skating, ballet, that these things that remain very feminized, that men who participate in them, once again, kind of like what I was saying about his and her media, the men who choose to participate in them do so at the risk of being policed and degraded and made fun of, and accused of being, sissy or being gay, which we'll talk about more in a second. But women do not necessarily face that same level of backlash when they participate in masculine dominated sports or jobs, right? They may not necessarily be welcomed with open arms, but oftentimes it's like, oh gosh, yeah. People will be like, I don't think girls should play football, but oh, that one girl who plays football, I mean, she is tough. I mean, she really is a good kicker. She can really get out there and hang with the boys. And that is what androcentrism is. It is that sense of, because masculinity is more valuable than femininity, people who do masculinity, whether they are cisgender men or women, or people who identify as something besides those two kind of binary terms, by doing masculinity, they will enjoy some societal benefits in the ways that doing femininity, particularly if you are not a cisgender woman, can come with very little societal benefits and instead come with a lot of societal blowback. And so, in addition to sports, another example that your book gives is just with names, that, names, once they become associated with femininity, oftentimes, they stop being given to, men. And people who give their boys names that are associated with femininity are oftentimes perceived in a much more negative light than people who give their daughters names that are more associated with masculinity or gender neutral. And so that the rise of the last name as first name, especially among women, that speaks to a trend, as opposed to, as your book notes, the decline of like a name like Leslie, which used to be associated with men, but then once it became associated with women, the number of people who stopped to then naming their sons Leslie literally like declined overnight. So that's androcentrism. And then finally, we have subordination. And so this is just, this is the third relation of power. And this term really emphasizes how oftentimes men and women are brought together in hierarchical relationships, and how when something is dominated by men or women, and even if it's not a hierarchical relationship, we then make it a hierarchical relationship, so that women are kind of placed in positions, or women's roles are seen as being subservient or dependent on men. And so this is why, oftentimes, nursing, which is still associated with women, and doctors still associated with men, although we have increasing numbers of women entering into medical school. So that if you're talking about the younger generation of doctors, I mean, we're almost reaching gender parity, but it doesn't matter because we still associate that with masculinity. And these two jobs are seen as being, in this hierarchy with one another, ignoring the fact that especially, registered nurses or nurse practitioners, they go to, a lot of school and they're extremely knowledgeable. But oftentimes their job, their role is seen through this very narrow kind of caretaking lens that denies them power, and instead just kind of makes them seem like they are helpers, with the much more important role of doctor, and that role, of course, being kind of associated with men. And it's not just with doctors and nurses. Your book notes that this gendered relationship exists between, managers and assistants, doctors and dentists and dental hygienists, lawyers and paralegals. And it's not that, you know, part of these job descriptions isn't meant to exist or be helpful, but it's more like when we look at them through this kind of subordination lens, we ignore all the ways that these occupations oftentimes come with their own educational requirements. They come with their own level of practical expertise. And instead, we kind of diminish what people know, and instead just kind of, like I said, narrow it down to this kind of form of professional caretaking, where it's like, oh yes, you just help out the dentist, or oh, you just help out the attorney, you know, ignoring, of course, that, you know, there are real that there's real professional expertise there. I think what's really interesting is that, you know, your book notes that because we see this subordination of women to men as normal, we sometimes see it even when men and women are in otherwise like equal positions. So the assumption that women are assistants to their male colleagues, even when they are in fact just colleagues. Or the example I used to give is, you know, when I was at CSUB originally, before I came back, you know, there was a male lecturer. Me and him had the same position. If anything, I had more experience because I had been doing it for like 6 years longer than he had, just at another school. But, you know, we were lecturers. And so that places us below the tenure track and the fully tenured people. And for those of you that aren't familiar with the sociology department, it's worth noting that a lot of our tenure track and tenured people are women. And our former department chair is a woman, and our current new department chair is a woman. Some students were coming by late in the day, and they wanted to know something, and it was kind of outside of my purview as a lecturer, and I was like, you know, I can't really answer that, but I was like, you know, I can tell the department chair, who's a woman, I can tell, I didn't identify her as the department chair, I just said her name. I can tell Dr. Anderson-Facil that you're looking for her. And what the student said was like, oh no, that's okay, I see so-and-so's door is open, and isn't he the most important person in the department? So I can just ask him directly. And it was really interesting because I was like, okay, you know, actually, he is one of the least important people in the department. And I say that as a person that shares that same low place on the totem pole. But that assumption that he would be the most important person and therefore the person that they go to, like, this is what's meant by implicit bias, right? Like, how did they magically come to that conclusion? Why would they assume that? Especially, like I said, in our department, where a lot of the people that were over him as well as over me were women, and the most important person in the department at that time was a woman. And so this is what your book means when people sometimes read into situations this gender subordination even when it doesn't exist. And the pictures that you see here are toy kits, and it's just worth noting, you know, I mean, why not have men on both, or women on both, or the woman as the doctor, the little girl as the doctor, and the little boy as the nurse? So, you know, this is kind of where that implicit bias comes from, is things like this, which we don't really think, we don't give a second thought about. But when we get enough of these kind of subvert or subtle covert, combine those two words there, these subtle covert messages, it kind of shapes what we see, right? It goes back to those gender glasses that we put on, those binary glasses that have us defining things as being masculine and feminine, men, women. But then not just doing that, if you consider the relations of inequality, it has us defining things as being men, women, dominant and subordinate. And oftentimes it is women that are in that subordinate, you know, that we put in that subordinate place. And so, you know, this is just a great quote from your text, and it comes from page 120. I feel like 120 is not the right page, that number that I put down there. But it says, this is what makes gender about power, not just difference. These asymmetries in the gender binary and the relations between men and women that emerge make doing gender a different challenge for men and women. And I really want you to consider this, right? It's that idea that, and you know what, and it's not page 120, it is page 134. Don't know where I got 120 from. But it's that it makes doing gender a different challenge for men and women. And so this picture that you see, which was from a photo shoot with, I think it's James Franco, it really drives home the point about androcentrism. Girls can wear jeans and cut their hair short, wear shirts and boots because it's okay to be a boy, but for a boy to look like a girl is degrading because on some level you think being a girl is degrading. So let's delve into that a little bit further. So, why do parents react so negatively to boys' feminine sides in a way that they don't with daughters' masculine sides, especially when you're talking about young children? And I know this because the author that your textbook quotes, Emily Kane, in past classes, I've used her book, The Gender Trap. That was the book that I assigned. I switched it up for you guys. But see, even I do it for you all. So easy, right? Implicit bias, that language. But she makes this point that oftentimes parents could come up with some pretty good explanations about how it's kind of a good thing to have a semi-masculine daughter. They say things like, oh, well, it's good. She's kind of tough. That means, she won't take no mess off of people. Or like, oh, in today's day and age, it's great. She's into sports. There are all types of scholarships like that. Or they might even say, I'm glad that she's not, too prissy and too cutesy and not one of those girls that refuses to get dirty and be outside. They spin a much more positive story around daughters doing masculinity. Not so with sons doing femininity. And I'd like to really emphasize, we're not talking about even 13, 14, 15-year-olds, in which case it should still be okay. But we're talking about little kids, right? You have fathers and mothers getting sometimes very upset about, sons who want to play with dolls, or, sons who they catch trying on, their sisters' ballet slippers and dance costumes. And what Kane finds is, it is that role of androcentrism, that kind of just implicit bias where we believe that masculinity is more admirable, more valued and valuable in society in a way that femininity is not. But then, of course, for men also, it is kind of the role of homophobia, right? The fear that even in your 4, 5, 6-year-old son, this preference for femininity in some way is indicative of their sexual preference. And not only is this just silly, but the idea that that a parent would think that the best way to then address that is to, I don't know, shove football and trucks and stuff like that down their throat as a way to, I guess, squash their potential gayness. Everything about that is just wrong. But oftentimes, this is the more likely response in a lot of families, that Kane was looking at, more so than being accepting. And they were much more accepting for their, daughters. And, and this is why when we talk about the symmetries that exist, but in the gender binary, you could think about, this is why sissy and tomboy are not equivalents, because, the idea that a girl is a tomboy, there is still in that label some latent kind of like respect and like some good traits. And it's like, she's kind of tough and aggressive and she can play with the boys, and it's not 100% a bad thing. But you can't really look at a term like sissy and how it's used and employed by people and find a lot of positivity in that term. There is no upside, there is no silver lining to that term. And so, tomboy may not be fighting words, and usually is not a fighting word. And oftentimes adult women will identify as being former tomboys during their child days. While in a lot of male circles, being called a sissy is our fighting words. It is upsetting, and a lot of men, if they identify as someone that was called a sissy, while growing up, it isn't like a point of pride that they say about themselves. Oftentimes, it's tied to very hurtful memories, and that's because, to go along with that androcentrism, the primary masculine imperative, right? How do you know you're doing masculinity right? The number one way to address that is to avoid the feminine. And so avoiding the feminine, means that you need to avoid not just things associated with women, but there is this link between sexual orientation and gender expression. And when I say link, I mean link in terms of how people perceive and talk about it, not link as in a link that really exists. But oftentimes, for men who do not avoid the feminine, they are kind of attacked with slurs linked to either femininity or to homosexuality. And it's because we conflate femininity in men with gayness. And in a society where, especially for men, there is this compulsive heterosexuality, and like I said, just a lot of kind of negative perceptions around sexual fluidity in men, much more so than women. I see people say it on the internet all the time, that, maybe women can be bisexual, but, they don't believe bisexuality exists for men, which is, once again, just one of them kind of crazy opinions, but opinions that people really do have. And the type of thing that, can really explain why, if men are seen as doing something effeminate, they will either be attacked along the lines of their gender identity or attacked along the lines of their sexual orientation. And therefore, this leads to that label of fragile masculinity. Because, as your book notes, being sufficiently masculine and avoiding femininity requires constant vigilance, extending to the most trivial things. And so if you aren't always constantly vigilant, you can be caught doing something not seen as being sufficiently masculine, and therefore labeled with either one of those slurs linked to femininity or slurs linked to homosexuality. And, there was a hashtag that went viral a few years ago that really tried to make that point. And the hashtag was masculinity so fragile. And it just really tried to point out, kind of the ridiculousness of these kind of arbitrary masculinity purity tests, these rules. But you can see this in all types of places and spaces. And once again, I'm talking about contemporary society, y'all. And so I give you a couple of links if you want to check some of this out. The link one is to a BuzzFeed listicle, and it just kind of is products that are like ridiculously gendered and geared towards men. Because the idea being like, if this product wasn't labeled as being explicitly for men, then maybe it would be considered, effeminate or, too feminine. So, they market it and package it differently, right? I'm talking about the blue razors versus the pink razors, the body wash that smells like, I don't know, pine cones and sweat. Well, I don't know what male body wash smells like. Pine cones and musk versus, the floral or sweet scents that, women's body wash has. So that's just a list of some of those types of products and how they're really playing on this fragile masculinity to get men to buy them. The second link is an article that your book actually mentions, 10 drinks real men shouldn't order in bars. And oftentimes fragile masculinity is evident by this kind of emphasis over what real men should and should not do. There are always these rules about what they can wear and how they behave and what they should buy, and in this case what they should drink. And sometimes this even pops up, of course, in ads. This is a Jim Beam ad that says Civil War soldiers getting their legs sawed off weren't given a vodka cranberry. So some really weird advertising here, where we're conflating strength with drink choice, but also amputations. Like I don't get why this would be a great copy for ad, but there it was in all of its appearing in a magazine glory. And then the final link is to a Dockers ad, which I frequently emphasize in my class because it's just so over the top in its messages, kind of bolstering, this idea that there's this right way to be a man, and that, men should be constantly working to uphold it. And so, I normally read this out loud in class, but just take a moment here and read this and some of those themes. They talk about how little old men used to wear the pants, and little old ladies never crossed the street alone, and men took charge because that's what they do. And then they, right there in the middle, they start attacking like this modern like masculinity, and they characterize it in these very negative terms. So they say, but somewhere along the way, the world decided it no longer needed men. Disco by disco, latte by foamy non-fat latte. Men were stripped of their khakis and left stranded on the road between boyhood and androgyny. But today there are questions our genderless society has no answers for, and the world sits idly by as cities crumble, children misbehave, and those little old ladies remain on one side of the street. For the first time since bad guys, we need heroes. We need grown-ups. We need men to put down the plastic fork, step away from the salad bar, and untie the world from the tracks of complacency. It's time to get your hands dirty. It's time to answer the call of manhood. So, whoa, a lot to unpack here. So apparently men caring about their health because they are, ordering a salad, men enjoying music, going to the disco. These are now things that are considered unmanly. That conflation of the word heroes, grown-ups, with men. So are adult women not grown-ups? The idea that little old ladies can't cross the side, can't cross the street on their own, or can't get assistance once again from women. This ad, which at this point out, is probably about maybe 12, 13 years old. It is a good example of what I mean when I say that, that the imperative to avoid the feminine, because to not avoid the feminine is to risk having your masculinity assessed and deemed lacking. That isn't just in men's heads. So, when that hashtag masculinity so fragile went around, a lot of it was targeted towards individual men. But I think it's important as sociologists that we acknowledge, where does this fragility come from? It comes from a society that puts these type of messages in advertisements, in our media, and then of course those messages pop up in the prejudices and stereotypes and the biases that we have, men and women and in non-binary folk, all those ideas that we have in our head. And so one real impact of this, of this imperative to avoid the feminine, is what we talked about before: male flight. When men leave something, a context, because it's become too associated with women. It's become overly feminized. And so in this chapter, they've already talked about cheerleading. They talked about baby names, not a lot of male Leslies anymore. They talk about, occupations, and I give you two articles if you want to read a little bit more about that. But, there's been sufficient evidence that shows that, oftentimes if the jobs available are in female dominated fields, especially if they are in the kind of low wage sector, a lot of men will remain unemployed as opposed to take those jobs. And you have to really ask yourself, why? What is the motivation behind that? We know historically nurses used to primarily be men, and then that changed. And along with it, the kind of the kind of professional perception of nurses changed along with it. And if you don't agree with me, about how male nurses are perceived by at least some people, think about that movie. What's it called? Meet the Fockers. That I think that was a later version, but maybe yeah, the first one was called Meet the Parents. But I'm sure you remember Ben Stiller's character. He was a nurse, a male nurse, and his girlfriend, later she became his wife, but her father, who was like a retired FBI operative, he made so many jokes about him being a nurse. And one plot point that, all these years later, because that is not a movie that I've rewatched multiple times, but all these years later, it still sticks out to me, how one plot point was him trying to demonstrate, that he took the MCAT and had scores good enough to go to med school, but he chose being a nurse. And, why he felt like he needed to prove that is hashtag masculinity so fragile, right? The idea that he thought he had to bring in this kind of his MCAT test scores to legitimate his decision to be a nurse, because being a nurse, while a perfectly good profession for a woman, is not seen as being as admirable of a profession for men. Another good example of a profession that has experienced that type of male flight, of course, are teachers. Similar to nurses, I mean, if you go back to the antebellum era, teachers were primarily men. We didn't start to see that rise of teachers being women until after the Civil War, and this was particularly in the South, as they created the freedmen schools for recently freed slaves. Those schools were originally taught by white women from the North, who then trained African American men and women to teach at those schools. But then after working in those schools, they kind of established kind of a standing tradition of school teachers, particularly lower levels, being dominated by women, particularly white women. Your book notes that just education in general, not just our teachers, are predominantly women, but at high school and junior college and college, and even increasing numbers of graduate and professional programs, women are outnumbering men. And your book makes some really interesting arguments, about what might be the long-term consequences of education being associated with women and female traits like studiousness and responsibility. And so, that be a real man, uphold masculinity, it's encapsulated by that dominant model of masculinity. And that dominant model, and this is a term you've already learned, is hegemonic masculinity. But we're going to break it down. And this was the same slide that I showed before. You got your strong, you got your successful, you got your aggressive, you got your athletic, you got your heroic, you got your, outdoors, activities. All of those are kind of traits that we associated with manliness, this idealized version of manliness. But we're going to break the term down a little further. So when we say hegemonic masculinity, well, maybe the first question is, what does hegemony mean? And so that term is basically an idea, it's referring to an idea that is widely endorsed and accepted by the majority of society. And what's really important is it's accepted by those who benefit from the idea, but it's also accepted by those who do not benefit from the idea, who are perhaps even hurt by it. And so, it's this dominant model that has this wide societal level acceptance. And so if you want to think about, if you want to think about it in terms of something besides masculinity, then, capitalism is a good example of a hegemonic ideology, right? So many people in America, strongly support capitalism, are really wary of socialist programs and state-sponsored safety nets. Although, as all the memes say, it's very true. Most of us are much closer to being, homeless than we are to being billionaires. But for a lot of us, we support this ideology, even if it doesn't really benefit us all that much. A historical example would be something like slavery in the South. So many whites were not, in fact, slave owners, and certainly weren't large plantation owners. But the number who supported the slave system, even though that system is part of what kept so many of them poor, because if you are a poor farmer, you and your little farm that's only worked by you and your sons is never going to be able to compete with the plantation that has like 200 people working for free. But the idea that those poor farmers also supported the slave system, went to war for it, that's what's meant by hegemonic ideology. So if you apply that same type of thinking to masculinity, what does that mean? That means that the hegemonic man is the real man in our collective imagination. He embodies all of the most positive traits on the masculine side of the binary. And we hold this idealized image of this man in our head, even though we may not know a lot of men like him, or if we are men, we perhaps might not be a lot like him. But this is what makes it hegemonic, right? It's that idea of we uphold it even when we ourselves are not benefiting from it, and don't necessarily perfectly illustrate it. And so your book makes a really good point, and I did get the page number right for this quote, or this paraphrase, that just by membership in the category, all men get to identify with the characteristics we attribute to men in general. And this way, men do benefit from the hegemony of masculinity. So what I say about this is, I have two examples, like from my personal life, and perhaps you can think of others on your own. Is I am athletic. I was kind of athletic in high school. I was really just a track runner, but certainly by the time I was in grad school, I got more into lifting, and I did the whole CrossFit thing for a while until I had some injuries, and now, of course, it's like a mix of like F45, Orange Theory, Pilates, yoga, like workout 5-6 days a week, and usually do 2-a-day workouts about 3 to 4 days a week. So, especially for my age, I am stronger and faster and in better shape, not just of most women, but also of a lot of men. I am amazed at the number of men that seem to go out of their way to brag about, well, men can, they can still do more push-ups than you, or, they're still faster. Men are still faster than women, or they're still stronger. Even though some of those men who are making that point are most definitely not stronger, at least if you're measuring it in terms of something like, I don't know, push-ups or pull-ups, holding a plank, and certainly not faster than me, regardless of kind of what you're talking about. But when they say that, it's not so much about whether they themselves as a man are faster or stronger than me, but the idea that the collective man, the ideal man, the hegemonic man would be faster than me, would be stronger than me, because athleticism and strength are qualities that the hegemonic man has. Another example is, I don't know if you know this, but, when you're in graduate school, doctorate program, you're like super broke. Like, you're living off of your stipend. Maybe you're living off a little bit of loan money. In my case, I was living off of too much loan money, which is why I have so much student loan debt now. But, the point is nobody has a lot of money. And when I was in graduate school, I dated a lot of other male graduate students. They always spoke about their future riches, watching out for these gold diggers. And I would always be like, this is somewhat ridiculous because you are broke. You have the exact same stipend that I have, and we're in the same field. So we both are like on the same occupational track. And once again, noting professors are really just not the type of profession that should go around like bragging about their goal. But this kind of like watching out for the gold digger, this idea of like this success that they're going to have someday, once again, is kind of predicated on this idea of the hegemonic man, right? Yeah, they weren't going to grow up to be, Don Draper or Bill Gates or Jeff Bezos, but it's the idea that when you are looking at, our richest people in America, our top CEOs, our billionaires, Forbes billionaire list, the majority of them are men. And so even if you are a man who is never on that list, that kind of collective of like, watching out for gold diggers, and success and money, they're calling upon that hegemonic man, even if they themselves, based on their salary, make the same as their partner or maybe even less. And that's how it works, right? Because even if they will never be that successful, it's that idea that the most successful people are men, and they as men belong to that category. Now, your book does note that there are some negative traits that are included in the hegemonic ideal. Specifically, they mention is being dirty, like, lack of cleanliness, and as well as like being bad with children, the opposite of nurturing. But, by including these bad traits in the hegemonic man, it allows everyday regular men to offer accounts that your book refers to as exculpatory chauvinism, right? So, exculpatory chauvinism, break it down. It frees someone from blame. And then the chauvinism, it refers to, bias in favor of men. And so basically it allows them to explain away bad behavior at the same time putting a spin on it. So, example, that I provide here is maybe a man saying to his female colleague after a meeting where he talked over her and shut her down, he might say something like, I spoke over you in the meeting because, men are naturally more aggressive. So that explaining away their bad behavior, by linking it to supposedly some innate, natural trait that exists in men, and even making this like potentially negative trait out to be like a larger positive. And in your book makes that observation that exculpatory chauvinism suggests that men are designed for dominance, right? So even something like being bad with children, that stereotype, that just means like, oh, well, I don't have to be nurturing because, my job is really to go out there to make the money and be the head of the household. And that's a good thing because you want the type of man that's powerful and aggressive and is out there making money, right? That's how that account would sound. Now, it's worth noting that although all men can kind of, point to the hegemonic man, as being this idealized kind of depiction of what masculinity is in America, not all men really embody hegemonic masculinity. Some men do not. And so the fact that some men do not is what allows us to establish society, what your book refers to as a hierarchy of masculinity, a hierarchy of the manliest men, the most masculine men to the least masculine men. And so, when you think about who best embodies hegemonic masculinity, consider what your book says on page 140. In Western societies, it's well-educated, tall, affluent, white, heterosexual, able-bodied, fit, Christian, and native born. And so, that is kind of the most idealized, and even when you're all those things, there might be some other qualities, you know, like that make you not necessarily the perfect fit with that hegemonic masculinity ideal. But then some men, because of their other identities, like, you know, their race or their socioeconomic status, or, you know, being disabled, it makes it largely impossible for them to embody hegemonic masculinity. So where does that leave them? Well, there are multiple masculinities. And so I am going to go to my next slide. And I will come back to this slide. So, you know, that hegemonic masculinity is that idealized version that kind of establishes the hierarchy. It is the counterpart. It is that the other masculinities are kind of comparing themselves to. So here are 3 other ways you can talk about masculinity, multiple masculinities in society. This isn't in your book, so this is one that, you know, if you don't really get it after hearing my explanation, please reach out. Because this actually came from a reading from that reader that I've mentioned several times that I am now regretting I did not assign to you. So the first is complicit masculinity, and I use Ross Geller from Friends as my example here. This is a man who doesn't fit the characteristics of hegemonic masculinity in some way. Usually it has something to do with their physical traits, like maybe they're short or overweight. Sometimes it has to do with their interests. So maybe they're not interested in sports, or they hate the outdoors. They're non-athletic. Or, you know, they are, or behavioral traits, like maybe they're very submissive and they're not a go-getter. But the key kind of thing about complicit masculinity is, even though they don't fit, they don't really challenge it. And oftentimes this is the type of person who admires the characteristics of hegemonic masculinity. So in some ways, they look up to people that have hegemonic masculinity. They might even aspire to, you know, that type of person. You know, so this is, if you know, if you're thinking about in terms of alphas and betas, these are your betas, right? These are the people lower down on the hierarchy. They're not at the top of the pyramid, but you know, they are not disparaging the people who are, the men who are. Marginalized masculinity, these are men who can't fit the hegemonic masculine ideal because of certain, usually, you know, traits like race that they have very little control over. You know, so this example I give here is LeBron James, because, you know, if Tom Brady is the hegemonic man, LeBron James is not, even though him and Tom Brady pretty much have like everything in common with one another in terms of social status and identities, with the exception of race. Because in the wrong neighborhood, you know, wearing the wrong hoodie with the wrong group of people who maybe don't recognize who he is, LeBron James is going to face some real systematic discrimination and mistreatment, and he's not going to have access to those resources, those status-based resources that Tom Brady has, on the basis of his race. So marginalized masculinity could also, besides race, could be people, men who have a disability, particularly if it's one that like results from an accident or from you know, serving time in the military. So something particularly that happens to them, you know, as an adult, that maybe like shifts their masculinity. And those are kind of maybe the 2 best examples for marginalized masculinity. Socioeconomic status, right? So being a poorer man, that's also a form of marginalized masculinity. It's not necessarily seen as being as absolute as race or disability, just because, of course, there's always the possibility, right, that you might win that scratch off, get that huge promotion, and so SES is a little bit more impermanent, or, you know, less permanent than the other 2. And the final type that I'm introducing here is what's called subordinate masculinity. These are men who exhibit qualities that are opposite of those values in hegemonic masculinity. These are men who ignore that imperative to avoid the feminine. They may exhibit physical weakness, or they might be very expressive with their emotions. Best example here is, effeminate men. And I give the character Kurt from the TV show Glee. And it's worth noting that, the reason why I say effeminate men and not, as opposed to referencing like sexual orientation and saying gay men, is because once again, this is about gender expression. And although gayness is associated with femininity, as your book kind of discusses, oftentimes people are talking about a very specific vision, perception of gayness, and in that sense, it's related a lot more to gender expression. Subordinate masculinity is something that is more likely to be experienced by someone like, this Glee character Kurt, versus someone like Michael Sam, the NFL recruit who came out as being gay. And he wound up being eventually dropped from his team. So I'm not saying that just because you're non-effeminate, that your sexual orientation doesn't still possibly, offer some real systematic disadvantages. But just in terms of this multiple masculinities, what really sets subordinate masculinity apart is that failure to uphold that imperative of not sufficiently avoiding the feminine and being effeminate. So going back to the previous slide. So, all of these other masculinities have their own relationship to hegemonic masculinity, because once again, that hegemonic masculine ideal is the dominant model in society. It's the one that's in people's heads, whether they agree with it perfectly or not. But even if you are one of those people who embodies hegemonic masculinity, your book notes that men's ability to perform hegemonic masculinity is always at risk. And they go over why, and that's page 142. The first thing they say is the hegemonic man is an impossible fiction, because it has some contradictions that it's just like, okay, if you're doing one will, you're not going to be able to do like the other will. Like that just is how that goes. And so, a good example is like, okay, so I think your book says a man can't be a perfect husband and a playboy. You can't be a team player, but then also be this person that's like mainly looking out for self. You can't have a great body and also, be a person that like drinks, a hard drinker that smokes cigars. And all of those are kind of factors or components of hegemonic masculinity. So it's an impossible fiction. Point two, as context change, the masculinities men are expected to perform shifts. And, they talk about, guy talk, for example, the fact that it's expected and encouraged in some contexts, but is a real no in other contexts. And so, exactly what traits of the hegemonic ideal you uphold and what traits you really promote in different contexts, it can vary. And one wrong move, one false step, can come with some real social, consequences and repercussions. So, it's important to be aggressive, but what does that aggressiveness look like, on your basketball court, when you're playing a pickup game versus at your job or in your classroom versus in your personal relationships. And so men have to be very savvy about, the performance of that trait. And like I said, a poor performance or, doing it wrong in one context can lead to, you losing that grip on that hegemonic ideal. And then the final point, a sad point but true, no one can win all the time. People lose, you lose jobs, you lose money, you lose, social status. Like I mentioned this before when I talked about marginalized masculinity, disability, that can be the result of military service or a car accident or a disease or illness or, anything like that. Overnight you could go from being able to embody that hegemonic ideal to no longer being able to embody that hegemonic ideal, through no real fault of your own. And then finally, at some point, if you live long enough, you are not going to be able to uphold that hegemonic ideal. Think about somebody like Hugh Hefner, who he was, what he stood for, being the epitome of a playboy and cool, in the 60s, versus being kind of a cultural kind of joke, by the time he's in his 80s, or I think he died when he was in his 80s. By the time he was in his 80s, and there being talk of, whether he was really or not having sex with, his supposed harem of girlfriends, and were they with him only for the money, right? At some point, even if you are able to hold on to that, to embody the hegemonic ideal for most of your life, at some point you will age out. So what does that mean for the average guy? Am I still going backwards? I am still going backwards. All right, here we go. If the goal is, and this is just something that a student once pulled off of Reddit, and it was the male college social hierarchy. And I just thought it was interesting because, without even, being in a gender class and hearing this term, hierarchy of men, hierarchy of masculinity, this kid out there on Reddit was like really kind of, really thinking about, the idea that men in his shared college setting, have, different kind of placements. And if you look at who's at the top, star athlete bound for major pro sports, star white athletes in major college sports, white athletes in major college sports, fraternity stars, hot white athletes, white athletes, minor sports, minority athletes, major sports, without using the terms hegemonic masculinity, marginalized masculinity, complicit masculinity, he is in fact really, classifying, how this might feel, to the average guy, that's aware that they are not the hegemonic man, and wondering, what does that mean? What does my placement in the hierarchy of masculinity mean? And although what it might mean might differ guy to guy, and there's certainly men who they could care less about this, but for the men who care, and I think that's what surprises a lot of researchers today, is that for a lot of men, they do still care. That is what the research suggests. Whether they openly admit they care or not, they certainly do in research. And so because they care, they try to the best of their ability to, uphold those masculinity rules. And they feel that they must try, because if they don't try, then what they face is emasculation. And with emasculation becomes kind of being placed forcefully or by choice in that subordinate masculinity kind of category. And, the consequences of being in that category is really going to be dependent on who you are, where you live, what stage are you in life? Because the consequences might be very different based on, I'm an effeminate man in San Francisco, California, versus an effeminate man in Poplar Bluff, Arkansas. I'm an effeminate man who is in high school versus I'm an effeminate man who is, in a solid partnership relationship in my 40s. So the consequences of being emasculated definitely vary. But for a lot of men, certainly at some stages of their life more than others, the goal is to avoid being emasculated. And so that is why masculinity is fragile. That is where fragile masculinity comes from, because it's premised on the notion of precarious masculinity, the idea that manhood is more difficult to earn and easier to lose than womanhood. So you always, once again, have to be vigilant that you're being sufficiently masculine. And so in order to demonstrate that you're being sufficiently masculine, your book discusses how men might practice compensatory masculinity. I give you an article about how men overcompensate when their masculinity is threatened. And so compensatory masculinity is just, being the manliest of mans, the broiest of bros, as a way to kind of avoid people gender policing you, of people assessing you and coming to the conclusion that you aren't being sufficiently masculine. And as your book notes, is although women can do this to men, usually a lot of the policing that men experience is done by other men. It's done by men themselves. And that is that policing that they oftentimes worry most about. And so this is a quote from Michael Kimmel, and it's from a documentary that I show in class. I'm trying to figure out maybe an extra credit opportunity during the next module, where I give you all the opportunity to watch one of several documentaries that I normally highlight. But this one is The Mask You Live In, and it's a great one about masculinity. And that's what it refers to. Masculinity as being this mask that men have to put on to not show emotion, to constantly be perceived as being sufficiently masculine. And so Michael Kimmel, who that is actually him there, and I've mentioned him several times in this class, his quote in this documentary was, "If I was to say what the major emotion of American masculinity is, it is anxiety. Why? Because you have to prove your masculinity all the time." Your book makes the same point. To be a man in America is to be arrayed in a hierarchy according to how well one does masculinity, and threatened constantly with the possibility of failure and slippage. And so another way of thinking about this that you maybe have heard before, and this is just one visual depiction of that, is the idea that men get trapped in what's called a man box, right? That this hegemonic masculine ideal becomes oppressive in the sense of, you feel like you have to do these behaviors, uphold these traits, otherwise you are policed. You're hit with these slurs, as mentioned, related to femininity. That's the misogyny side, or homophobia, which you see that side. And so this leads to this kind of being trapped inside that box, right? This traditional hegemonic definition of masculinity becomes oppressive in that way. But before we talk a little bit more about to what extent does the average man notice and experience that oppression and how they respond, let's make a point about intersectionality, because of course we skipped that chapter, and we'll be coming back to it in the upcoming weeks. But your book does note that this isn't as straightforward as we're making it sound, because once again, people do have other identities besides gender. You have to remember intersectionality. So on page 143, they say being male is an advantage, yes, and being a masculine male is a greater advantage. But men who can't or won't do masculinity, or whose masculinity is stigmatized, will find themselves near the bottom of the masculine hierarchy. And women with other kinds of privilege, like race or class privilege, may enjoy greater overall social esteem. So basically just saying, that although there is still some privilege in being a man, that particularly if you reject masculinity, that because the rejection of masculinity, your acceptance of subordinate masculinity, of being more feminine, of failing to sufficiently reject the feminine, this might put you in the situation where women who, although, despite their class or race privilege, are experiencing oppression on the basis of gender, their overall experience in their life might be such that they get greater overall social esteem better social capital, more access to social resources than a man who is rejecting that masculinity. And so, it's just the idea that men might have other disadvantages that can outweigh their gender advantage in general. So, even if you are a masculine man, if you are disabled, or if you are poor, or if you are a person of color, or if you're very old, right, you may not be able to make the most of your male privilege because of those other identities. But your book notes that usually one group that those men still usually have more power than are the women within their own group. So it's like, okay, if you are a man and you are disabled, you may not be able to make the most of your male privilege compared to other men who are not disabled, but you probably enjoy more privilege than a woman who is disabled. Or if you are, a man and you are old, senior citizen, once again, you maybe lose some of the privileges associated with your manness, but you still have some privilege over your female elderly counterparts. And so, that's just a reminder that although we focus on gender in this class, gender is not the only identity that matters. Now, going back to this idea of the oppressiveness of the hegemonic ideal, let's look at this quote from page 143, 144. As the expectation that men live up to an impossible ideal, the uneven way in which masculine power is distributed, and the pressure men face to be someone they're not, many individual men do not feel particularly powerful at all. Many feel downright powerless in many areas of their lives. Men, it turns out, often feel a disconnect between who they are and the power men are said to have. So, ignoring kind of, what I just said about how privilege and different identities can kind of structure differential access to power. It's worth noting that part of why people push back when you talk to them about privilege is oftentimes invisible. I mean, if you think about the definition of privilege, the one that I often use in my class, and it's based on a theorist who is known for outlining the numerous ways in which whites and men and heterosexual individuals enjoy privilege in society. The definition that she created said that, privilege is like an invisible knapsack of resources that you can pull out at your disposal. And keyword there kind of is invisible. Oftentimes, people who have a specific privilege are sometimes unaware that they have it. Usually people who lack that privilege can see it a lot more clearly than those that who actually have it in society. And so this is true for a lot of men when you're talking about the privileges that come with being a man and being associated with masculinity. So why don't they see it? Why don't they feel it? And part of it is because of, in a lot of ways, there is a real crisis in regards to masculinity and boyhood in society. And so, this kind of gives just some areas in which we are becoming aware that the gender gap in men and women is not a positive one in the sense of these are negative variables where we see a real kind of distinct gendered consequences, or not really consequences, gendered impact, I guess. That the boys are more likely to flunk or drop out of school. They're more likely to be assigned to special education. They are more likely to be addicted to internet porn, that they are more likely to commit suicide. And so, if it doesn't seem like things are going very well, then it would be easy to ask, like, okay, well, then how am I privileged? What is the privilege behind that? Well, before we talk about how the privilege still exists, or, why we consider, men and boys to still hold a privileged status, despite those stats I just listed, let's talk about where we can point the finger of blame for a lot of those stats, and that is masculinity itself, and particularly like the hyped up on steroids version of masculinity, which we refer to as hyper masculinity. So, what is hyper masculinity? So this is a masculinity that kind of pushes extreme conformity to the most aggressive, stringent rules of masculinity, right? So this is that, a real push to be, tough, and aggressive, to the point of violence, to take a risk, to be not just sexual, but sexual, promiscuous. Hyper masculinity is the traits associated with masculinity pushed to their extremes. And we see society glorifying hypermasculinity in a lot of ways. We can see it in different forms of music, particularly the music that's most consumed by young men, like your heavy metal and your hardcore hip hop. You see it in movies, particularly your action movies, and even your superhero movies. You see it in sports. My first hockey game, the idea that, that the rink is set up that they actually, like, would turn on special lights and do a cheer when these fights would break out. All of that's glorifying, not just athleticism and not just masculinity, but hyper masculinity, right? This idea that you are aggressive to the point where, you're beating a stranger in the face, with your hockey stick, as people cheer that on. So we certainly glorify hypermasculinity. And sometimes we like to explain it away and be like, oh, that's just how men are. Men are naturally violent. They're naturally aggressive. But once again, I want to remind you, before you make that statement, to think back on chapter 3 and why that statement is not true. We know it is not true because the idea that men are violent does not meet the standard established for something to be a real difference. So if men aren't inherently violent, why do so many men in fact become violent and overly aggressive? And your book makes the point that that's because we nurture this like extreme male aggression in certain settings. And those settings can be everything from fraternities to police squads to gangs to prison to military units. That there are segments of society where men spend the bulk of their time around other men, and the version of masculinity that they promote is this hyper masculine version. And in not just where there is this promotion of being aggressive, of being tough, about taking risks, but that these settings also do what is called anti-empathy training, which means they teach, encourage, police men into shutting down their emotions, shutting down their empathy. And that's why we call it anti-empathy training, right? We create spaces from a very early age where boys are taught that they shouldn't cry, and that the only emotion that is acceptable to show is anger. And so if you think about it that way, it's not so much that, they're born naturally violent and aggressive, but that, if you, especially for men that can check off maybe multiple, of those settings I just named, just think about kind of what that long-term effect would be if you go through your life being socialized in multiple spaces, that encourage you to uphold this hyper-masculine ideal, and at the same time also provide this anti-empathy training, which makes you shut down like these other more emotional, reflective, introspective parts of yourself. And so in this way, even something like that you would hope that would be maybe like a positive, like friendships, turn out to maybe not have the positive impact that, you know, we would hope that they would. Because your book quotes the researcher, psychologist Niobe Way, who talks about how, you know, like the friendships that like younger boys had, you know, they often talked about in these, you know, really sweet terms about, you know, how close they felt with their friends, how much they loved them, how supportive they were, but how oftentimes there is this transition in male friendships during adolescence, where, you know, the friendships become, you know, more competitive and more distrusting and more superficial and more shut down. And so it's this idea where it's like, okay, it's not just that you have to keep this mask up in so many public contexts, but that you have to also maybe keep it up among your friends. And two kind of ways in which we see this encouragement of not of keeping up this mask, not being your real self, is the popularity of the term "no homo." That, you know, it had its moment. That idea that anything that you express that could be possibly conceived as being effeminate, emotional, associated with women, you had to add "no homo." Which of course just really undercut, you know, the ability to interact and communicate with people in a real, meaningful, and deep way. Similarly, the idea of what's called the bro code, you know, it's a lot of those behaviors that are endorsed by the bro code, as well as the behaviors that are prohibited by the bro code, you know, break along those hegemonic masculine, you know, behavioral expectations, right? So, you know, if the bro code is, you know, no snitching, you know, even when your friend is doing something dangerous or illegal, you know, this encourages all types of negative behavior. And of course, it inhibits people from being a real friend. If, you know, the bro code is you get together, you play ball or you play video games, but you don't do a lot of talking, because that's for women, once again, it really inhibits the ability for real, deep, and lasting friendships um, to flourish. There was a book I used to use in one of my classes that said that a lot of male adult friendships are what they call side-by-side friendships, while women's friendships are face-to-face, meaning that a lot of the male adult friendships are activity-based. You know, we're on the same bowling team. You know, we play video games together. We work together. But the focus was oftentimes more on activities and less on talking and disclosure, which of course meant that the friendship itself was in a lot of ways a lot more superficial in terms of closeness. While women's friendships face to face, the emphasis there was that in a lot of female friendships, the emphasis is on talking, it's on disclosure, it's on getting to know the person versus doing things. And this is a more personal relationship. And so, you know, if you can't trust your friends, you know, to provide you this outlet, it's also worth noting that you can't even necessarily trust that your friends aren't going to aren't going to enforce this hyper masculinity. That they're not going to be one of the people that police your behavior. Because it's worth noting that when we talk about gender policing, we've already said while men do receive this from women, they receive it from other men, and this can be men in their lives who they are close to, as well as just male strangers. They can receive it from their friends, and they also can, of course, self-police. And it's worth noting that the form that the policing can take, you know, varies based on the type of relationship, you know, that you have with the person, as well as what you're doing that is inspiring the policing. So, you know, a lot of verbal taunting is used, and it's used by boys, um, uh, people they are close to, and you think it starts at an early age, right? Telling young boys to suck it up, boys don't cry, be a real man, don't be a sissy, don't be a punk, right? And maybe you're getting those messages from men in your life who, you know, who you care about and you love and who you know are supposed to love you. So what does it mean when they're saying these types of things to you? It's hurtful, right? Or, you know, then you later maybe hear it from your friends as they say things like no homo, or that's so gay, or calling each other fag, right? That's a form of policing. Of course, if you're getting it from strangers, then it has the possibility of being perhaps, you know, more violent, you know, so those slurs can easily then can become actual physical assaults and not just verbal assaults. And so all of this means that whether or not the men who uphold and practice hypermasculinity, whether it's something that they truly support, whether it's something that they truly feel, or, you know, they feel like truly is who they are, it's worth noting that a lot of men who practice hypermasculinity are doing so as a form of self-protection or defense, right? This is what is meant by compensatory masculinity. Hypermasculinity is like an extreme form of that compensatory masculinity, doing masculinity in this extremely heightened, overt way as a way to avoid this potentially hurtful, emotionally as well as physically, gender policing. Now, one consequence of this of masculinity, of doing this extreme version of masculinity, is harm to self. You know, how do we know this? Well, because one element of hypermasculinity is being a risk taker. You know, risk taking is dangerous. You know, young men are more likely to die between the ages of 18 to 25. And a lot of that is related not just to violence, which we'll be talking about in a second, but it's related to accidents, as well as self-harm. So accidents, young men are less likely to wear a seatbelt than young women. Young men are more likely to engage in unsafe behaviors, everything from unsafe sex to speeding and reckless driving. If you've ever watched any of those stupid YouTube videos, young men are much more likely than young women to do those types of dangerous pranks and stunts that can result in injury, disability, or death. And unlike young women, who risk-taking isn't a part of the feminine ideal, it is much safer and easier for a young woman to say, without fear of being gender police, like, hey, slow the car down, I'm scared. Or, hey, you know what, maybe we shouldn't jump off this bridge, this seems dangerous. Think once again about that man box, and, you know, depending on the circles that you run with and the context that you're in, if you're a young man saying these things, you might find your behavior it receives pushback, as people try to keep you in that man box by saying things like, what, are you a chicken, are you a sissy, are you being a girl, right? And so that does encourage this risk-taking behavior. Then self-harm. Alcoholism and binge drinking rates are much higher for young men between the ages of 18 to 25 than young women. I've already said that, you know, suicide rates, we talk about the rising rate of suicide among young people, but we oftentimes don't mention that this is also very gendered. The number of young men who commit suicide is much higher than young women. And once again, if you're thinking about why, you know, think about the long-term implications of forcing upon boys this anti-empathy training, of teaching them that it's not okay to cry, to not show emotion, to not talk about their feelings. And if they also find themselves in situations where they don't have friends that can provide a safe space to be their real selves, if they are in friendships and on sports teams and in families where they have to keep the mask up, right? How this can be contributing to unhappiness with their self and despair, in the sense that they have no one to turn to and talk to. If we switch to adult men, we know that compared to women, men are more likely to take on dangerous jobs, and they're less likely to use safety precautions on those dangerous jobs. It goes right back to what we talked about when we were talking about risk taking. The idea that, practicing safety is somehow seen as being less manly, and men are less likely to practice self-care. When I teach the family class, I have a joke where I say, hey men, if you want to live on average 15 years longer, and you're heterosexual, you need to make sure that you get married. And it's true. One marriage benefit that exists for men but not for women, meaning married wives don't live longer than single women, but married men live significantly longer than single men. That is an established benefit in the research. And although there might be numerous reasons as to why that exists, a lot of it does have to do with self-care. That having a wife makes you more likely to eat a balanced diet. And maybe even more importantly, having a wife increases the likelihood that you will make and keep regular doctor's appointments, which as you age become necessary for certain wellness checks. So this idea that real men take risk and real men don't practice self-care, real men, don't worry about safety. Real men, don't drink whiskey drinks and drink straight liquor and drink a lot of it. Real men don't cry. Real men don't go to therapy. All of this contributes, these messages that exist in that ideal of masculinity. It contributes to men causing a lot of harm to themselves. It also contributes to them also causing a lot of harm to others. So in the same way that suicide rates are gendered, violence against other people is gendered as well. So it's worth noting that men are more likely to be both the victims as well as the killers, when we look at our statistics in regards to violence. And that's because male on male violence rates are very high. Male on female violence rates are also high. Female on male violence rates are comparatively much lower, and female on female violence rates are the lowest of all. So why are men so violent to each other? Why are they so violent to women, particularly their intimate partners, but as well as strange women they do not know? Once again, you might want to look at, this is what happens in a society that perhaps encourages anti-empathy training, that encourages people to be violent. We'll talk about it more, especially in regards to women later, but that puts out this idea that women are a prize, that men deserve to win. This leads to something that we call thwarted entitlement. The idea that men feel entitled to attention from a woman. They feel entitled to loyalty from a woman. They feel entitled to a smile from a strange woman on the street. And certainly not all men, hashtag not all men, but certainly for some men, when they do not receive that from women, they are liable to lash out violently. And in terms of male on male violence, when you have men who have been socialized with these messages about being aggressive and the importance of, being respected, accorded this certain level of respect, and all types of things being potentially labeled as a sign of disrespect, it's perhaps unsurprising that you are setting the tone, you're setting the context, you're setting up the situation where men are going to mislabel each other's actions as being disrespectful, and perhaps feel like the only recourse of action once they've been disrespected is a violent one. And so, looking beyond, physical assault and murder rates, we also know that men are more likely to join gangs. They're more likely to enact suicide bombings. They are much more likely to be serial killers and mass murderers than women, and they're more likely to join violent hate groups. And for those last two, I give you additional articles if you want to read more about that. But yeah, a lot of the percentage of violence in our country that's committed by men is just staggering. Whether you're talking armed robberies, where it's 86 to 14%, whether you're talking murder, where it's 10%, 90%, whether you're talking domestic violence incidents, 86 to 14, whether you're talking self-harm in the form of suicide, 87 to 13%. Men in this country commit a staggeringly high amount of violence in comparison to women. And like I said, please resist that knee-jerk urge to say, well, that's because men are just more violent than women. Because once again, going back to our chapter on biological differences, that is not in fact true. We know that testosterone, that there is a hormonal feedback loop, but there's also this placebo effect. We know that we can look at different cultures, past and present, and know that this isn't how it has to be. And because it's not how it has to be, that means that it's not natural. It is socially constructed. And the social construction being that we have created this concept of masculinity, and then this heightened definition of masculinity, hyper-masculinity, and men who feel pressured to uphold masculinity, hegemonic masculinity, and particularly hyper-masculinity, find themselves at risk of self-harm or harm to others. And so this is why, if you've ever heard that term toxic masculinity, this is why we refer to it as being toxic, because toxic masculinity refers to the strategic enactments of masculinities that are harmful to both the men who enact them and the people around them. Now, do the authors conclude that hegemonic masculinity and toxic masculinity are the exact same thing? They don't. What they say is while the hegemonic ideal is not the same as the toxic versions that are drawn from it, men's efforts to live up to it can be harmful. Right? So they're not saying that the hegemonic ideal necessarily is toxic. More like toxic masculinity is the worst spinoff of the hegemonic ideal. But, because this ideal does exist, and there are these social pressures to uphold it, that can be harmful to the men themselves and to other people in their lives. So, why don't they just say screw it, right? Why don't they repudiate it and be like, I reject this definition? Well, before your book gets into why, they instead kind of provide some information on what most men are more likely to do, because they note that most men don't repudiate the hegemonic ideal. Instead, they do what is called a patriarchal bargain. And this is a deal in which an individual or a group accepts or even legitimates some of the cost of the patriarchy in exchange for receiving some of its rewards. And they note that both men and women enact patriarchal bargains, but their motivations differ. And, they say for men, part of why they accept to some degree the subordination in the hierarchy of masculinity is because it allows them to claim a higher status than women, as well as some other men. So basically it's like, this is referring to the men who aren't at the top of the hierarchy pyramid. And it's like, hey, I would rather there be this pyramid, even if I'm not at the top, because at least there are people below me. But your book notes that very few men make these bargains out of a desire for power. power. So very few are like that overt in their desire to be empowered and have power over other people. They say a lot of these bargains are initially made and continued to be made because what they really just want is a desire to be happy, to have some level of social esteem, and have some self-protection from that gender policing that, particularly for men in certain contexts, can be potentially violent and even life-threatening. And so they make these bargains because they're like, hey, if this is the dominant model, I really don't agree with this model, but I really don't want to be bullied. I really don't want to be harassed. I really want to get a promotion at my job. I really want, this to have friends and to have romantic partners. And so they make a bargain, right? They're like, no, I'm not going to be on the forefront, fighting to tear this model down. I'm going to uphold it in some ways. And we've already talked about the fact that very few people uphold it perfectly. Most of us are out there some way cutting a deal with that dominant definition. And then if we get caught, deviating, we offer some type of an account to people as a way to avoid societal backlash. But what's really worth noting is that when men cut this patriarchal bargain, when they accept this patriarchal bargain, it involves valuing other men over women, because by supporting the patriarchy in its current form, it is the acknowledgement that, women are nowhere in that hierarchy of men, that women do not experience that the privilege of male bodiedness. Some women can experience some benefits if they appropriate some aspects of masculinity, i.e. your tomboys when you're little, your top female athletes in sports associated more so with men, like basketball. Women to some degree in corporate America, if they're willing to make the patriarchal bargain of emphasizing the ways in which they are just like their male counterparts. But for a lot of women, this modified patriarchy doesn't come with a lot of benefits. And so for the average guy to make this bargain in order to enjoy this social esteem and self-protection, regardless of his personal reasons for making that bargain, he is aligning himself with men, against the interest of women. And your book gives two examples of this. They talk about telling the sexually demeaning jokes, even in front of women who might find them upsetting or controversial, but instead you prioritize the male bonding aspect of the joke over making your female counterpart uncomfortable. And then they talk about the gay male fraternity, which it was created around two identities, gayness and maleness, but while they welcome other men, so the maleness part of it, what they don't welcome are lesbians. And they only allow them to interact with the fraternity, they said, in the little sister subservient kind of status. So if you think about this concept of the patriarchal bargain, and why, the average guy upholds this modified patriarchy, even though it results in this hierarchy of men, of masculinity that they are probably not on the top of. And even though hegemonic masculinity can be very oppressive and harmful, they uphold it to still get these benefits. And so if you think about it this way, it really shines a different light on Gamergate, which your textbook discusses, and I give you an additional article if you want to read more about that, as well as the incel communities, incel standing for involuntary celibate, because in these communities, right, these are oftentimes men who are complicit masculinity at best. Very few of these men that, the Gamergate incident or incel communities, these are not your hegemonic ideals. But oftentimes their acceptance of gender inequality, their perpetuation of gender stereotypes, and in both of these cases, their perpetuation of gendered violence against women. It's like they are rigorously defending and fighting to uphold a system that they're not even in the top of. And your book makes this point that paradoxically, it may be the men who benefit the least from hegemonic masculinity, as well as the men who benefit the most who defend it most aggressively. And, of course, it makes sense why the people who benefit the most defend it aggressively. That's some, nah, duh logic, right? If it works for you, you don't care about other people, why would you not want it to keep working for you? But the fact that people who like rationally looking at it, it's like this system isn't really benefiting you. So the fact that a lot of those people also work so hard to uphold it, as your book notes, that is paradoxical. Now, certainly, especially in contemporary society, there have been men who are pushing back against this dominant model. And your book calls this kind of contemporary conception of masculinity hybrid masculinities. And so, what do these hybrid masculinities, look like? And so to think about hybrid masculinities is they selectively incorporate symbols, performances, and identities that society typically associates with either women or low status men. And so they might mix some of these feminine aspects into their personalities, into their lifestyles. They might, in terms of their gender expression, and so in some ways, it is a progression away from the hegemonic masculinity ideal. Now, your book notes that for a lot of gender scholars, they feel like these hybrid masculinities are, at least in their current form, not living up to their potential. They note that a lot of them are just symbolic, and so if it's not really committed to changing and restructuring the modified patriarchy that we live in, it's like, okay, if you're not kind of committed to this like structural change, and this is just a symbolic type of gesture, what is kind of the long-term benefit of this? They note that for some of the men who adopt hybrid masculinities, they sometimes ask for extra credit for being good men. And so it's like, okay, because because I am this type of man, shouldn't I be allowed to do XYZ because that I have better intentions than that man over there who isn't this type of man. And so that's problematic. I kind of think about this as like the horrible kind of toxic guys that, complain about being like friend zoned. And it's like, no, like just be a friend. Like it's not a zone. Like you don't get to be in a woman's life and be a friend in hopes that, you reach some magical point where now you get to be more than a friend or sexually intimate. So I think about it like that type of way. Like there is no extra benefit. There should be no expectation of extra benefit for being a better guy. And then finally, your book notes that there's a tendency for the men who adopt these hybrid masculinities to use them to claim status. So it's not like they're tearing down the hierarchy of masculinity so much as, at least in their circles, in their context, they're replacing it with their own hierarchy that places them at the top. And once again, it's like, this isn't very revolutionary in terms of really redoing or addressing the system. And so in that way, at least in their current form, a lot of hybrid masculinities are in many ways just another patriarchal bargain. And although I do think your textbook is a little harsh on hybrid masculinities, I feel like we should give them a little bit of space, just because this is a relatively new form. And I think I am maybe much more hopeful than the authors that they will find their way and they will become something more revolutionary and progressive. But I say that maybe just as a optimist. I'm not going to say that I have like research that supports that progression is necessarily going to happen. And so, that question, can masculinity be good? Your book notes it's a hard question to answer. And part of it's because in a modified patriarchy, masculinity is still associated with power and is still dependent on a definition of femininity that is weak. And when you define masculinity and femininity in that way, you're going to have, as a result of that, things like sexism, androcentrism, and subordination. If we were to be able to magically strip from masculinity some of the more dominating, toxic, and compensatory behaviors and traits, there would be some good things that are left in that masculine definition, things like leadership and hard work, loyalty to family. But then, wouldn't it also be necessary to define those traits as also being possible to belong to women? Like, they aren't traits that are just inherent in men. And I love the quote from that section, that good men aren't good men, they are good people, and they share good traits with women who are good people too. Like, I feel like that is really important, right? This idea that, for a better society, we need to focus on being good people and not good gendered people. But in order to get to that magical spot, what that path looks like is really unclear. And part of it is because, we still have this very knee-jerk reaction to describe people as good men and good women. And then we characterize their goodness often in these gendered ways, even though it's totally unnecessary. And that raises the point, men can be good, but, do they need the concept of masculinity to be that? Why isn't it enough to just say that men are good people? And the final question, is masculinity good for men? Well, the data is much clearer there. Whether or not masculinity can be good is unclear because of just the complications of, what masculinity is, how it's perceived, and so forth. But that final question of, is masculinity good for men? Well, the data is much clearer on that. And the answer there is largely no. Even when we consider the self-esteem benefits that come from doing masculinity well and receiving some societal kickback, for doing so, it's still a form of oppression, and it hurts men, in whether we're talking self-harm, harm to others. And for some men, it hurts them just a little, right? Like, it was hurtful maybe when your dad told you, suck it up, don't cry, don't be a punk. But for some men, it might hurt them a lot, right? If they truly are having to wear a mask in order to fit in with that ideal, in order to not stand out, in order to avoid that violent, perhaps life-threatening gender policing, then for those men in particular, masculinity is really harmful. And so we revisit the question we start with. If both men and women are constrained by a binary gender system, why is it more women than men find the system unfair? And so the chapter provides reasons why men should find the system unfair, even those at the top of the hierarchy of masculinity. Because number one, that's not most men. And even those men who are at the top won't stay there forever. Yet, despite providing ample reasons why most men should repudiate and refute this kind of like narrow definition of masculinity, most men don't do that. Instead, they strike patriarchal bargains, and some, including those who should find it least advantageous, they defend that narrow definition of hegemonic masculinity vigorously, and in some cases, fatally. And so, your book makes that point that ironically, men who have the most to gain by rejecting the gender binary are often the ones who are most defensive about it because their grip on it is most fragile. They defend hegemonic masculinity because at the very least, it guarantees them superiority over somebody. That somebody those somebodies are women. And so that brings us to the end of this chapter. Obviously, our next chapter will be discussing women. We'll be discussing femininity. But that is it for masculinity.